Hello, friends, and welcome to the Weekend Catch Up Club, the coffee morning show brought to you live every Saturday direct to Facebook and available later on demand at youtube.com/gamertide. Today, I am joined by another incredibly special guest. It is the narrative designer from Ubisoft. Joining me today is Inari. Welcome to the show, Inari.
Thanks for inviting me.
It is an absolute pleasure to have you. I've been hearing so many wonderful things about you from friends and contacts and colleagues. So I just had to get you on the show. And I would love to obviously find out how you're doing during this pandemic lockdown life, and also find out your entire work history and have a really great conversation about what it is you do. So let's start at the beginning. First of all, how are you and how are you doing?
I'm doing great. The third lockdown was announced in my city yesterday or the day before. But as someone with a dog, I spend a lot of time outside with my dog, allowed to do so. So the pandemic really hasn't been that hard for me for the last year, especially since I'm someone that likes to be alone. So I'm alone in my house with my dog, and when I need to go out, I'm just taking my dog out. So it's all right.
Sounds like quite an idyllic lifestyle where you're comfortable just being in solitude with your dog.
Yeah, I can see the difference with my girlfriend, which has a lot more trouble staying alone at home. But yeah, I'm doing great compared to many friends that I have. So I'm just thankful for that. Not for the lockdown and pandemic, just for being able to cope with it that good.
Yeah, it's been incredibly challenging. I agree, and I'm fortunate enough to also have a dog. So just being able to get away from the desk and take the dog out for nice long walks in the afternoon has been hugely beneficial, because normally I would be in the office and I wouldn't get to take the dog out till it was like really dark at night and horrible weather in Scotland for sure. So it's been a bit of a treat this past year in a weird sort of way. It's like, oh, the lockdown hasn't been too bad. It's been quite nice actually.
Yeah. In general, I think dogs are good for our health, but with the pandemic going on, I think it's even better, way better than cats. I love cats. Don't mistake me.
Yeah, I love cats too, but they can be devious sometimes, shall we say?
Yeah.
But you can't really take them for walks. Although I have seen a couple of people with like harnesses, little these cute little tiny harnesses on their cats, taking their cats for a walk. I'm thinking that's impressive. I'll give you credit for taking your cat for a walk.
They're adventurers, so they need to do it as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, can we talk a little bit about obviously you and your role as a narrative designer, what that is, and also like how you got there? What was your start from the very beginning in the industry? I mean, going back through your work history, and it is hugely impressive and quite extensive. And I just love you to take us through that journey.
Yeah. If we want to start from the beginning, Final Fantasy VII moved me back when I was a teenager, like even before. I wasn't even 10. I think I was 9 when I got it. And back then, that game was a revelation, because before the only games I've had were, I think, Street Fighter, Super Mario, Pokemon, and Toka Touring Car. So
some classics.
It was the first time I had a story-driven game, and it really moved me. And I started writing my own story following this. So I didn't know what that was called, fan fiction, back then, but I was doing that precisely. And a few years later, I discovered Mass Effect. And while Final Fantasy VII moved me to write, Mass Effect was a revelation because of choice and narrative design. So those two games made me turn to tabletop RPGs when I got around 16, 17. I started playing that. My first game was called In Nomine Satanis, where you play as demons against angels, and it's a humoristic French game.
Okay.
So I graduated from high school, arrived in my city to be studying art history. and I started being part of an association dedicated to tabletop role-playing games. And while watching the television, a French television called No Life, which was dedicated to geek arts, for short, I discovered that game called Sense, which is a French one, again, dedicated to explaining philosophy to tabletop role players, sorry, and also to bring people interested in philosophy towards tabletop role playing. And I ordered the book on the spot, received the first 2 books 2 days later, and I read one day and the second the day after, and started the campaign. And spreading the word about this game, I ended up talking with the author, which became a close friend of mine, and he was leading a podcast, a tabletop RPG podcast in France, which was the biggest one back then. We had a few thousand listeners every month. So I've been podcasting there for 4 years, from 2010 to 2014. While studying. So after art history, I went to foreign languages, applied to business, where I was studying English, Japanese, but also economics, law, and communication.
Wow. Wow, that's a lot of complicated fields.
Yeah, it's just a bit of everything so that you can be able to work in international companies.
Right.
And at some point, I was like, yeah, but I'm good at designing tabletop RPGs, at testing them, etc. I want to work in games in general, not especially video games. I like those, but that was not my main hobby. And I was partying someday, and a friend of mine told me, "Hey, I'm studying in that school. They're teaching game design." Oh, sounds nice. So when I came back the day after the party, I registered for the entrance exam. 1 week later, I was taking it. And 1 week later, I was registered in the school, which is a French school for video games and 3D animation, where I studied for 2 years, not the third, because I decided to finish my studies in northern Finland.
Oh, wow.
Which was a great experience. I really miss Finland. And so the first 2 years in game design, I had internships. The first one was in a company called Fremencorp, which is a small French company doing serious games and some other stuff. Like they're currently live with a Kickstarter for a game called Mage Noir, which is a card game where you create spells to face the other player.
Right.
And the year after that, I went to my internship was in a place Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity that depends on one of the biggest French universities. And I was a serious game designer there. I opened the game lab, and that was, fairly interesting. I started teaching game design and a bit of scenario to people that were not initially interested in games, just so that they could teach through it. I even ended up working on a game to teach about, to teach kids to take their asthma treatments.
Wow,
which was very interesting.
That's hugely impressive that you've gone from kind of starting out at junior positions, really just graduating into like teaching about game design, gamification, in such a very, very short space of time. That's honestly incredible.
I got opportunities and I took those. I'm really grateful for my career in general. I've had so many nice people helping me over the past few years, and I thank them if they're ever listening. When I was in Finland, I led a team of people coming from 4 different continents. We were working on a poetic Metroidvania called Aniris, where we were playing a mother whose kids were abducted by a totalitarian regime. And unfortunately, I had to go back to France at some point because I was lacking funds, because my first school was really expensive. And that's part of why I went to Finland. It was costing less.
Right.
because my school was like 7,000 euros a year.
Yeah, that's hefty.
Plus accommodations, etc. Finland was free for education, so I just have to pay for rent and food. So it was way better.
Were there any grant opportunities available to you at that stage?
No, because since I was studying in a private school in France, I couldn't be part of the Erasmus program. And that was really sad. But I was with the Erasmus students there anyway. So I went back to France, and since I had left for almost a year, I had lost all my video games network. So that was a bit sad as well. But I decided to come and live in Lyon, where I currently live. And some friends of mine were just getting out of their school, which was business school, and wanted to create a mobile MMORPG. So I tagged along while having another job to pay for my rents because we didn't have any funding back then. So I was a barista. That's why I love coffee and I love talking about it.
Yeah.
So I was a barista, and then I turned to graphic design for tourism-related objects for 1 year and a half. During those, I got an opportunity to start teaching as my main activity. So I became a freelancer, taught game design in several schools while I was looking for contracts to be working on, which I ended up doing. So I taught for 2 years while being a freelancer. I've been working on a TV game show, on a board game with an AI, on mobile games, etc. One of my last projects was epilepsy related. It was to raise awareness on epilepsy. And last year in July, I joined Ubisoft.
So can you go into a little bit of detail about the game that you're talking about for epilepsy awareness? Because as someone myself who suffered from epilepsy for much of my childhood up to early teenage years, and all of a sudden the kind of past year or so it's been making the headlines quite significantly with certain titles. Can you explain like what that entailed and how developers can do more to ensure that things that they don't think about necessarily that could trigger epilepsy attacks or seizures can be really like overcome, but with the work that you've done?
So that game was ordered by the French Association for Epilepsy. It was both intended at people suffering from it and people and their relatives, so that they can raise awareness around them. So we ended up doing a kind of a point-and-click game where you had to go through scenarios that taught you about seizures. So doing the game, I had to do a lot of research about epilepsy. It was a topic that was touching me personally because one of my friends died from it a few years back. And so the game really isn't that thrilling because it's a hard topic, and any game that is ordered by an association or a company that is not directed, led at least by people who love games always end up very small in scope. But we did our best so that people can understand what does epilepsy entail and how hard it is, how hard it can be to be living with it when you're alone, or even if your relatives are there, because the worst part of epilepsy isn't actually the seizures. It's mostly how people look at you, because when you say epilepsy, everyone is thinking about the huge seizure where you're shaking, etc. But there's so much more to it, like blackouts, like 1 minute blackouts, especially for children. So that can really hinder learning. And there's so many more different types of crisis that you can have. And I'm lucky not to be epileptic, but I really wish that this game can help people that live with it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if anything can raise awareness for an issue in a different format that's more interactive and not just like an education tool, even though it is an education tool, but it doesn't feel like you're getting lectured at, I think can be hugely positive. And that sounds just really, really fascinating.
Yeah, even when I was studying, I started a small group with friends of mine dedicated to talking about health issues and how we could tackle them in video games, because games is the first way animals learn in general, not video games, but games in general. And in my opinion, we have a responsibility to be educating people with it at some point.
Yes.
Not every game has to be a learning tool, but since we're becoming the first medium, we have to.
Yeah, I think there is a responsibility there to a certain degree to not hit people over the head with certain things, but to at least have something there which can open conversations and educate, and whether it's more subtle or passive, but I think it's hugely important to at least include it or try to incorporate that stuff. So you're obviously your work experience is extensively quite incredible. Can you explain specifically what narrative design is? Because my understanding is that it's a fairly new-ish field or job specific title, but it's actually encompasses a lot of things which have been in the industry for, I guess, a long time, but now it's being called narrative design. But it's a hugely important role, and I know you love to really talk about it and be an advocate for our narrative design. So please take it away.
Yeah, so it's not that young a title actually. Stephen Deinhardt the fourth actually created it back in 2006, if I remember, when working at THQ Nordic. So that was the first time the job was mentioned in the industry. But a few years later, I think it was Monolith in 2011 that made another announcement for a job offer for narrative designers. And 2 years later, Microsoft did the same. So when Microsoft did it, so like 8 years ago, it was the start of the narrative design as a discipline.
Right.
Because right before it was unknown. That it's hard to say in English. It happened to be the time where I started being a game designer.
Okay.
Well, my first position was as a quest designer, so kind of narrative design oriented, but in levels and missions. And I knew I wanted to be a narrative designer because I was good at tabletop RPGs and narrative systems, and good at game design. I was in the top tier of my promotion, so I knew I could do something with it, but it needed to be spread before. So I think the last 5 years have made the title narrative design explode in the industry and in the mainstream content, but it's actually been there for 10 years. What it is, in my opinion, is game design specialization dedicated to narrative systems and how to deliver the story. Unfortunately, most companies use narrative designer like they would use game writer, while those are two different jobs, in my opinion, and in most narrative designers' opinions. We have to work together, and it's all right to be both. But as for me, I'm a game and narrative designer. I'm not a narrative designer and game writer. Even though I said I was writing fan fiction about Final Fantasy VII, I'm really bad at writing. I don't have a notion of tone or technique or stuff like that.
Right.
However, I love to prepare the work for game writers to be done and to edit them, to edit their work with them afterwards. That's how I've been working at Ivory Tower with my team of writers that are in Canada. So in general, narrative designer is about story delivery. rather than the story itself.
Okay. So whilst you're not directly in control of the tone, the dialogue, what the character's going to say and everything, it's the narrative for like consistency and like the world is like the world building feel of that world and making sure that everything makes sense to immerse the player.
Yeah, that would be closer to what we do as narrative designers. I'm in a bit of a tricky position because I'm the only narrative person for 200 people, so that's quite a bit of work.
That's a lot of heads to that will be reporting into you and to manage as well. That must be pretty daunting, I would have thought.
Oh, it's all right because we're not focused on narrative. But yeah, the narrative design is about maintaining consistency, considering what the player wants to be playing as. If you want to make a game about Jedis, we have to make sure that you feel like a Jedi. Mm-hmm. Not just someone tells you you're a Jedi.
but like the way the NPCs are reacting to you, or the world is reacting to you, or the way you're reacting in the world doesn't reinforce that.
Yeah. So as I'm advocating for a position called technical narrative design in general, just to make sure people understand I'm not focused on writing, but it's also it can mean many things, including making prototypes, pacing, implementing in-engine stuff. That's things I do, but since I'm the only one, I'm just technical and narrative designer. Like the systems part is really what I love doing, but I don't get to do it that much because the systems in the crew license are already made, kind of. So I'm focused on lead and content with the player experience director, so that we can do stuff. I can't say much more, but
sure. Yeah.
I'm managing high-level content, sending it to the writers, and then I'm putting it into the engine and directing voice actors. And also I maintain documentation for other people in my team to get information when they need it. And that's pretty much it.
Wow. So how challenging has it been for you to get recognition in this particular field? Not just at Ubisoft, but also other companies as well, to have this established as a not just a legitimate discipline, but an essential discipline as well.
Well, I'd say it's pretty tied to the success of games like Life is Strange and Telltale Games, which really spread the word that this narrative isn't only text and dialogues. Mm-hmm. So I would say those were just the starting point. And also, when we stopped being focused on technicity and innovation in open worlds, we realized, that's kind of bothersome to be doing the same quests over and over again. Let's try and implement something different. If you've played Ghost of Tsushima, there's that part where you are making haikus.
Yes.
Which is an amazing narrative design moment, in my opinion. Like, you get a headband in the end, but the moment where you just stop the game, contemplate, and pick sentences was amazing.
Yeah, in my opinion. An incredibly risky feature, really, because if you're at an internal planning phase of the game where it's a very action-driven game, you're playing a samurai who's trying to reclaim and repel these invaders. You're trying to rally some allies to your cause, and then there's this feature where the game pretty much completely stops, and it's a section of reflection and meditation, and you could easily see how something like that would just get cut out entirely because it's stopping the flow of the character. But then the developers obviously stuck to their guns and believed that this was vitally important because it is that breathing room to then reflect on the actions that you've done up until that point in the world, and to just appreciate the world that they've created with this island of Tsushima.
Yeah. It really is an amazing moment. I don't think it breaks the flow that much because, in my opinion, what it does is reificating it. Like, you have so many things happening. If you don't take those times to rest, there's not only the haikus, there's the praying to the Inari temple. Hey there, and
Yeah.
going into the hot springs as
Yeah.
well. Those times are really amazing, and they tie together the experience, which would otherwise just be another open world where you have too many things to do.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
I agree. I mean, Ghost of Tsushima is easily one of my favorite games of that generation, certainly, and it's because all of these components that don't feel checklisty or just going and hunting for feathers or for headbands, or it's the ways in which that they have formed the mechanics around the experience.
Yep.
Everything from the wind system, which I've been praising ever since it first kind of came out. It's a navigation system. It's a GPS system essentially, but it's not an icon on the map pointing you there. It's guiding you by following the wind, like you're a proper explorer, and this world is fully alive and you're in the world. And I don't know what the impact of this game is going to be. I hope developers are paying attention to a different way of doing core systems, like core game systems that would normally rely on a HUD and icons to really explain it to you, make it like as blunt as possible. This is where you need to go to get this thing. But then they've shown a really elegant solution for giving you the same player feedback that you need to accomplish your objectives.
Yeah, well, Ghost of Tsushima has a lot of good things. Some things are less so, but I had been advocating for removing HUDs, and not HUDs in general, but at least minimaps or compasses from the screens for a few years. Like, the start of my narrative design threads is precisely that. And it was before Ghost of Tsushima was released, because as a player, even when I'm playing like Borderlands, I just look at the minimap and I'm not playing.
Yeah,
like,
you're not engaged in the world at that point.
Yeah, because the minimap is easier to read than the screen, to guess where the enemies are. So why should I be watching the screen with enemies that are covered when I can know where they are from the minimap, which is poorly placed in general. Like, the bottom right screen of the screen is the part where we look at the most. So if you want your players not to be looking at the minimap all the time, just put it anywhere but there. But when going into Ghost of Tsushima, the guiding wind was really refreshing, because it forces you to watch what's around you and to be in this contemplative experience where you're part of the world and the world helps you as well. I've been doing the game in the Kurosawa mode.
Oh wow, hardcore.
I never did it into the color mode. I just did it this way, except there's a few missions that rely on color.
Yeah, I was about to suggest that, because that's the only thing that put me off. My first playthrough was in the regular mode, but the Kurosawa mode is such an interesting addition for samurai cinema, and I would love to do it. But as you say, there's a couple of key missions which you need to know the color of the flowers, so it falls down there, which is a real shame.
Yeah, a bit. I think that the game will have some impact over the next few years, because we are getting more and more into immersive worlds, and that's an amazing example of how to manage a narrative, narrative ludic system, let's say, within the diegesis, within the story, within the universe, and everything ties together into one direction.
Yeah, I totally agree, because removing the HUD is not something new in games. Plenty of games have done it, but most games have only removed the HUD and nothing else, so you're not getting the same player feedback that you would get with a HUD, but you need to apply systems that work when there's no HUD, and therefore the world needs to give you the feedback. One of the better examples, which still had a HUD that comes to my mind, was Dead Space. So it's still got a HUD, but it's integrated into the character. Like the health bar was in Isaac's suit. The stasis power was all integrated into what the character is wearing, rather than having a meter at the side, which is like this overlay of a traditional HUD. And I honestly thought that would have been way more influential, that more games would have done it. And I know some games have flirted with the idea of doing that, but then if it's like a cover system based thing, well, you can't have the energy bar on the back of the suit, because when you go into cover, you no longer see the energy bar. And there's these lots of other problems that stem from the type of game that you're trying to shoehorn this stuff into.
Yeah, the type of game really has an influence, in my opinion, because if you're making a fast-paced game, you need clarity, and HUDs are better at clarity than diegetic devices, unfortunately, at the moment. I think we can find other ways to do it, but when I'm playing typically Borderlands, there's so much happening on the screen that I can't rely on diegetic devices to be informed about what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, well, especially when there's numbers flying everywhere, and as well as the different weapon types of effects that are going off, and it's just this crazy menagerie of chaos like happening on screen.
That's the core of the game, and that's why I love it.
yeah, absolutely. So, we've obviously mentioned Ghost of Tsushima and Borderlands. What's been some of your like examples of games that you've experienced recently that have made a big impact for you, that have got it right, in your opinion?
What do you say? What do you call recently?
Well, I mean, it could be like the entire PS4 generation.
All right, so
maybe
the first one would be Gris by Nomada Studio. I was really afraid of getting into the game because it seemed like it was going to be just another platformer with no difficulty, etc., and it was just pretty. But I took it, and I couldn't lift my eyes off it when I was doing it. I really did it in one run on the 31st of December. I rushed through it, and in my opinion, it's one of the best convergence of every system in one game. Like,
wow, okay.
The narrative design, the system design, the game design, the music, the art are all going into the same direction, telling the same story, and it doesn't rely on words. So when I'm telling narrative design with this game, at least I don't think people think about writing, because there's some scenario, but not dialogue. So it's a bit finer. So yeah, that's, in my opinion, the best convergence of our disciplines recently, which is funny because it's the first game of a studio and from a country where, Spain isn't the biggest video game country yet. Yep. It's growing, but it's not the country you'd bet on initially, I'd say. In general, super giant games are really strong, in my opinion. I started with Transistor. I loved Fire, and I spent way too much time on Hades.
Like I think we all have, right?
Yeah.
BAFTA winner as well. Just recently, we got the BAFTAs.
Yeah, 2 days ago. It's an amazing game. Possibly. I know some people are complaining about some systems or stuff like that, but I think it's a very good entry door to the roguelike experiences, because it's very easy to get along with. There's a lot of narrative. It's beautiful. So it's fairly easy to try and stay, because the game it's not punishing you that hard, and you have the God mode, which is helping a lot because I really suck at action games. So I used it a bit just to finish the game.
Yeah.
A few times.
Yeah. Hades is impressive because it does something which a lot of games don't always nail, and that is giving you an incredibly complex game, but introducing the player to its complexities very well, that each new skill that you are introduced to is building your skill base in a way that is incredibly satisfying. It's not overwhelming.
Yeah.
And as you get through these different tiers of hell or the underworld, then you're starting to chain together all of these different abilities and skills, which is an incredibly complex set of systems. But had you been just thrown into the deep end with all of that at the very beginning, you would have been completely lost and overwhelmed.
Yeah.
But it's that they did such a great job, and the whole way in which they developed that game, being very public and open about it, is so refreshing as well, because it was in early access for a couple of years, and then they really developed that with community feedback, and that is not always something that we see in the industry at all.
Yeah, in France we have Amplitude Studios, which had a platform called Games Together, where they're talking a lot with the players, and they used, at least, to be asking the players when the game should be released, rather than telling themselves, we are going to release on this date.
Yeah.
They're just exchanging, and at some point the players were like, yeah, the game is kind of ready to be shipped. You can enter the polish phase and let's get together. Like Humankind was recently delayed, and they were just open. Like this week I saw an article about what they're doing with the time they got from the delay. So that's a nice approach to video games. I think we should go towards more transparency, because too many people think video games are done like that. Just they pop from nowhere, but it's actually hundreds and thousands of hours of people sweating in front of screens. So
that would be really something, and I do wish for greater transparency as well, because, as you said, there is this lack of understanding as to just how much work goes into these games and how much love and passion the developers put into it, but they're always hitting this deadline phase, and therefore obviously crunch is a big issue, which has come out in the past from certain studios. But if there's more kind of transparency to say, look, we're really driving for something here, but being open about the different development cycles and stages would maybe give the audiences a greater understanding to be less impatient. It would be a dream. I don't think it will get there, but you know what gamers are like. We like to be impatient. It's like, I want my game now. But it would be great to say, you know what, this is just not ready, and we need more time. And we've been seeing that with a few games recently, where they're just getting removed entirely out of 2021 and getting moved into 2022. And obviously a big part of that is COVID, the pandemic and the impact of working from home with major productions, of course. But I think also from the back of that, I'm getting the impression that studios are beginning to just open up a little bit more to say, you know what, we don't want to launch our game and then have a PR nightmare of things that are broken, things that are patches not working, and we just want to delay it. And that kind of open dialogue, these statements, I think curry a lot of favor with the public. So that's hugely encouraging going forward.
Yeah. It can be tricky though. Recently I did a podcast with Max Pierce, which is working at CD Projekt, and that will be your guest in 2 weeks, if I remember.
Yes, he's going to appear.
And yeah, what happened with CDPR was a debacle. Let's be honest. I'm really sorry about what the teams had to live through on release. But I think if had they been honest, I'm not sure the gamers trademark would have been kinder to them. Really not sure, because 7 years of waiting was a bit too much for them. Don't hate the players, hate the game, like they say, but
it's that particular situation is really difficult, because it was always marketed and promoted on that hardware, and even got announced before the PS4 and Xbox One had even actually launched. That's when they first announced the game. So to miss the entire generation and just go for PS5 and Series X would have been really difficult for the audience to get behind, I think. Even though hindsight, yes, that should have been what happened, because on Series X and PS5 it ran pretty well for sure, but still not great. There's still issues, but you just can't ignore an entire generation of systems which were expecting the game, and that is such a shame the way it rolled out.
I really like that so many games these days are doing the forward compatibility system. Like you buy it for PS4, yeah, you'll get it on PS5. Don't worry, we can manage.
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to tell people we're not here to milk you from all your money, but if you want to come back to the game later, don't worry, we'll be on the next generation as well. I think that's a very good practice. I've always been frustrated with the lack of retro compatibility on the PS3 and PS4 systems.
Yeah.
Because I used my PS2 to run every PS1 game that I had. So why did we stop? I know there's a lot of architecture going on this, and it's fairly hard. But as a player, it was rather difficult to live through.
Yeah. I think that's where Xbox, the past few years, with their backward compatibility initiatives, and certainly for Series S and X, they're doing such a great job with that messaging and that quality of life features for their fan base, to be able to go right back to the original Xbox games, the OG, Green Machine, and all those games basically work via backward compatibility. Well, not all of them, I should say. Like a vast majority of them do work.
Yeah.
And with smart delivery, I know back when it was announced, I think for the most part, marketing were like, well, that's just marketing nonsense. It's a buzzword as a selling point. But as we've seen with games coming out, with the all you don't have to do is put your normal Xbox game into it, and you'll automatically get updated to the next gen version. It's not just marketing like nonsense. It's actually working, and it didn't sound like a very sexy bullet point feature for the new console, but it's proving that it's an incredibly effortless user experience for the platform, and it's incredible how the two platform holders have approached this differently. And I know PlayStation 5 will get a handle on the easy ways to upgrade their games without having to download the old generation version, migrate saves, and do all of this crazy stuff. They will get there, but it just shows you the different mentality for Xbox. They were always gearing toward building on the foundation to easily upgrade the upgrade path for that ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's also a responsible thing to do, because not forcing people to upgrade immediately is nice. And like, I have so many old consoles at my place, and I'm never putting them on my TV. But I'd love to play some of those games. So I have so many like gold chunks. I don't remember the the English word for it. Sorry. That I'd love to show my friends, but I can't. I don't want to take the hassle of getting the box, putting things out, and putting it into the television to remove it 2 hours later.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, there are these like upscaler devices which you can do to get like your classic Mega Drive games, your Saturn, your Dreamcast consoles running on HDMI upscaler TVs. But again, it's a hassle, right? You've got all this extra kit that you need to set up and then unplug at a later point. I think more games will hopefully be backward compatible, but I don't know, maybe
we'll see in the future.
Yeah, exactly. So Inari, we are coming to the end of this morning's show. It's been an absolutely great chat. Thank you again for taking the time and explaining to us what narrative design is as a discipline, championing it. I hope to have you back for a future show, and I've had a great time talking to you.
Thanks for inviting me. I'll come back gladly. I love to talk. So no
Excellent.
problem. I'm a designer.
we could talk design as well. Two design heads together.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to the Weekend Catch-Up Club. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I certainly have. And I'll be back again next week with another great guest. But until next time, take care and happy gaming. Bye-bye now.
Bye.